Alright, so we welcome you guys back to our logic tutorial video. But first of all, I would like to say a very big thank you to some of our viewers that has been able to identify one mistakes or the other concerning our previous video. And I will use this moment to implore us that whenever you are watching any of the tutorial video, always endeavor to go through the comment section, because there might probably have been some correction or one correction or the other that has been made. So in our business for today, we are going to be talking about SORITES and antonyms arguments. SORITES and antonyms syllogism rather. We recall the last time that we talked about syllogism. We said syllogism is an argument with three different terms, which are the major term, the minor term, and the middle term, and it has two different premises and one conclusion, in which all these propositions are started from categorical proposition. So first of all, we are going to be starting with SORITES. What is a sorite? Sorite are just elongated syllogism. Sorite are just elongated syllogism. That is, instead of having a syllogism with just three different terms or two premises and one conclusion, let's assume in a situation whereby the argument is giving us, let's say, four premises and one conclusion, or three premises and one conclusion, or four different terms, five different terms, or six different terms, depending on the number of syllogism that we are going to be constructing out of the sorite. In order to cut the long story short, the point I'm just trying to make so far is that SORITES are just elongated syllogism. So let's give us an example and we explain how to solve them. So let's say, for instance, we have an argument like all born again Christian, but because of space, I'm just shortening the born again Christian to BC. So all born again Christians are superstitious people. All born again Christians are superstitious people. Then the next one, some timid Nigerians. Some timid Nigerians are born again Christians. Some timid Nigerians are born again Christians. Then the third premise, all timid Nigerians are people of low self-esteem. People of low self-esteem. All timid Nigerians are people of low self-esteem. Therefore, some people of low self-esteem are superstitious people. Therefore, some people of low self-esteem are superstitious people. If you look at this particular argument now, it has three different premises and one conclusion. And our knowledge and understanding of a syllogism told us that we are going to be having two different premises and one conclusion. So that actually gave us a fact that this is a SORITES syllogism. That is, it is an elongated syllogism. This is a SORITES. And the proper syllogism that we know usually have three different terms, which are the major term, the minor term, and the middle term. So how many terms do we have here now? We have born again Christian, we have superstitious people, we have timid Nigerians, we have people of low self-esteem. That means we have four different terms instead of three. So what do? So now the formula that we use in explaining or in resolving a SORITES argument is called n minus 1. That is n minus 1. N means number of premises, so number of premises minus 1. So n minus 1, n means the number of premises. So the point I'm trying to make is that what determines how many syllogisms we are going to be having in one SORITES is, the formula is n minus 1, the number of premises minus 1. So how many premises do we have in this argument? Now we have 1, 2, 3. That means we have three different premises. And if the formula is n minus 1, that means 3 minus 1. 3 minus 1 gives us what? 2. That means after resolving this particular SORITES, we are going to be having two different syllogisms. That is, we are going to be drawing two different Venn diagrams separately. So that means we are going to be having two different arguments in this particular SORITES. So how do we do it? You take the first premise first. You take the first premise. So because of space, I'm just going to be saying all born again Christians, all B, are superstitious people. S. So I did not do any magic. I only took the first premise first. Then I take the second one too. Some timid Nigerians, I'm representing that with C, are born again Christians, B. So after taking the first and second premise, you'll be the one to bring in the conclusion yourself. You will say therefore. So what I did was that I just bring out the first premise, the second premise, then you'll be the one from that first and second premise, you'll be the one to derive the conclusion yourself. So now all born again Christians are superstitious people. Some timid Nigerians are born again Christian. Then what's going to be my conclusion? Don't forget that our knowledge of a syllogism or a syllogistic argument states that we have three different terms. We have the major term, we have the minor term, and the middle term. The terms that occurs in both premise but absent in the conclusion is the middle term. And if you look at this argument now, we already have born again Christian in the first premise, born again Christian in the second premise. That means born again Christian is our middle term. Automatically, born again Christian will not be in the conclusion. So now the next one, we now have superstitious people. We also have timid Nigeria. Don't forget that our major term is the predicate of our conclusion. The knowledge of syllogism, I'm just explaining it again. So the predicate term is the major term. Sorry, the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. Now, what is the major term? Of course, we explained that the major term will always be in the major premise. That is the first premise. So all born again Christians are superstitious people. If born again Christian is already middle term because it appears in the two premise, that means superstitious people is going to be our major term, and timid Nigeria is going to be our minor term. And of course, we said the major term is going to be at the predicate of the conclusion. So that means superstitious people is going to be here. So I don't know whether I should write born again Christian here or write timid Nigeria here. Of course, born again Christian is already my middle term, so I cannot put it in the conclusion again because the middle term is the term that occurs in both premise but absent in the conclusion. So that means timid Nigeria is going to be the subject of the conclusion, which is our minor term. So now I don't know whether this place should be all or no, and I don't know whether this should be or not. I don't know whether I should say all timid Nigerians are superstitious people, or I should say some timid Nigerians are superstitious people, or I should say no timid Nigerians are superstitious people. But the first thing that you should put at the back of your mind is that whenever any of the premises, whenever there is a particular proposition in any of the premises, then the conclusion must be particular. Whenever there is a particular proposition in any of the premises, then the conclusion must also be what? Particular. Don't forget that when we did existential import, we said it is not possible for us to have a proposition that everything contains universal proposition, then the conclusion is not going to be particular, because universal proposition has existential import, but particular proposition does not have existential import. So the first thing that you should bear in your mind is that whenever at least there is one particular in the premise, the conclusion has to be particular. So that means this space is going to be sum. And if this sum is odd now, then this space has to be odd too. So the point I'm trying to make is that whenever there is at least one particular proposition in the premise, when you want to write your conclusion, the conclusion must also be particular. Then another thing is that I don't know whether I should say some timid Nigerians are superstitious people, or I should say some timid Nigerians are not superstitious people. But another rule to also be in your mind is that the only time that you use negative as the conclusion is when there's already a negative in the premise. So that means if there's at least one negative in the premise, then the conclusion has to be negative. But if there's no negative in the premise, that means the conclusion has to be positive. So that means some timid Nigerians are superstitious people. So let me just recap again for everything that I've taught so far. So like I said, SORITES are elongated syllogism. That is, rather than having three different terms, it has different kind of classes in that particular proposition. And rather than having two premise and one conclusion, it might be three premise and one conclusion, four premise and one conclusion, five premise and one conclusion. This particular argument now has three different premise and one conclusion. So the formula that I'm going to be using, like I said, is n minus 1. N means number of premise, that is the number of premise minus 1. So if this is premise, if this is three premise minus 1 is going to give us 2. So that means we are going to be having two different arguments, two different syllogistic arguments in this particular SORITES. So let's say in a situation whereby the number of premise is 4. 4 minus 1 is going to give us 3. That means we are going to be having three different syllogism or syllogistic arguments in this SORITES. So now, like I said, you take the first premise first, take the second premise, then you derive the conclusion for the first and second premise. So how did I derive the conclusion? Automatically, I know that my middle term cannot be in the conclusion again because it appears in both premises. Then after discovering that the middle term cannot be in the conclusion, I look for the term that is also in my major premise, which is the first premise. Is going to be my major term. That means superstitious people is here. all born again Christian is there. So since born again Christian is already my middle term, it cannot appear in the conclusion again. So superstitious people is going to be the predicate of my conclusion. Then timid Nigerian is going to be the subject of my conclusion, since it contains the minor premise that is coming second, and the minor premise here that is coming second, and the minor term will be the subject of the what, of the conclusion. So then, in order to figure out whether I should use all as the quantifier and I should use are or are not as the copula, don't forget that I said as long as there is one particular in the premise, then the conclusion has to be particular. Then I said the only time that you use negative in the conclusion is as long as there is one negative in the premise. So if there's no negative in the premise, then the conclusion has to be affirmative. But if there's already one negative in the premise, let's say in a situation whereby we have one negative and one affirmative, then the conclusion has to be negative. But if the premises are affirmative and affirmative, then the conclusion has to be affirmative. If the premises are negative, the conclusion has to be negative. So the only time that you use negative in the conclusion, that the conclusion must compulsorily be negative, is when the premise has at least one negative. If it has at least one negative. So I've already derived the first one, the first the first syllogism. So let me write out the form for this particular one. So let's say the form is A I figure what? Figure 1. A figure 1. So now, since I've already derived the first syllogism in this SORITES, rather than me using Venn diagram to test it first, let me derive the second one so that I can test the two together. So now the conclusion that you derived for the first syllogism, the conclusion that you derive is not going to serve as the main premise of the second set of syllogism. So that means some T R S that I wrote last, I'll now write it again. Some T R S. Then I will not take the second one, all timid Nigerians. I will not continue from where I stop here. All timid Nigerians, all timid Nigerians, that's T, are people of low self-esteem. Let me say P. Therefore, some people of low self-esteem, some P, are superstitious people, S. So the conclusion that I derived myself is not standing as the main premise. The conclusion I derived myself is not standing as the main premise for the second syllogism. And I just wrote it out, some T are S, then I continue from where I stopped. All T are P, some P are S. So if you should look at this argument again, and the second set that did not even form anything, you will see that the middle term is there, this is the middle term. Then the predicate of the conclusion is our major term, and the major term will be in the major premise. Automatically, it has already formed itself. Then the subject of our conclusion is the minor term, and the minor term will be in the minor premise, which is the second premise, and automatically it is already there. So it is that simple. So let me write the form for this particular one too. I figure 3. So now I've already brought out the two different syllogistic arguments in this particular SORITES. So what is left for me to do now is to now use the Venn diagram to test the validity or invalidity of those arguments. In the SORITES, as long as one of the syllogism is invalid, then the whole SORITES is invalid. A SORITES is only valid when all the syllogism containing the SORITES are valid. In other words, it is not possible for me to have an invalid argument in a valid SORITES. So as long as one is invalid, everything is already invalid. So what I want to do now is to use Venn diagram to test this first one, use Venn diagram to test this second one, to see whether the two of them are valid. If the two of them are valid, then this particular SORITES is valid. But if one of them is invalid, then this particular SORITES is already invalid. But because of space, I'll be rubbing it off for me to be able to draw my circle and write it again. But I hope you guys have seen it first before I rub it off. So let me just rewrite it so that I'm not going to lose the content. So the first one is all B R S. Second one, some T R B. Third one, therefore, some T R S. I'm just rewriting what is here because of space, so I'm not performing any magic. So let me rub this off. Then the second one, some T R S, all T R P, therefore some P R S. So let's use Venn diagram to test the validity of the first one first. So automatically, you know that when you are using Venn diagram to test the validity of a syllogism, you are drawing three different circles that go to intertwined on each other. So that means the first circle, the second one, and the third one. So if you want to label the circle now, the predicate of your conclusion, the predicate of the conclusion is going to be on the right hand side. That means this S is going to be here. The subject of the conclusion is going to be on the left hand side. That means this T is going to be here. Then the middle term is what is going to be in the middle, B. So if I want to use Venn diagram to test the validity now, so you already know how to test the validity of a syllogism using Venn diagram. Once you diagram the first premise, you diagram the second premise, automatically the conclusion should diagram itself. If the conclusion diagram itself, then that argument is valid. But if the conclusion does not diagram itself, then that argument is invalid. So now all B are S. All B are S. If we say all B are S, that means we have to look for B that are not S to shade it off to indicate that it is what? It is empty, because all B are S. The only B that we are going to be sparing is the B that is S. Any B that is not S, we are shading it off to indicate that what? It is empty, because the proposition states that all B are S. So if all B are S, let me look for B that are not S. So all this place now, all this circle, there's the circle of B that are not S. So this place that B and S comes together, this where the circle of S ends, then that means this place is the circle of B that are also S. But all this place like this is the circle of B that are not S. So I'm shading it off. Shading it off signifies that what this particular place is empty. So if I say all B are S, that means there's no B that is not a S. So any B that is not S is empty. I just shaded it off because the proposition states that all B are S. Then the next one, it says that some T are B. What I just need to do, some T are B, is to look for where T and B are coming together and put X there. So when you put X, S indicates some. So some T are B. I just need to look for where T and B comes together and put my X there. So if you look at this place now, T and B comes together here, because this is where the circle of, this is the circle of T and this is the circle of B. So T and B comes together here, and T and B also comes together here. But I cannot put my X here because I've already shaded this place to indicate that that place is empty. So if I put my X there, it is more of like saying that that place is empty and there is also something there. So that means that is a contradiction. Automatically my X cannot be in this place. So another place that C and B comes together is in the middle. So I'll put my X in the middle. So some T are B has been diagrammed. So let's now look at it, whether the conclusion has diagrammed itself or the conclusion has not diagrammed itself. The conclusion states that therefore some T are S. So let's look for where T and S comes together, whether there is already X there. If you look at it, you know that you see that T and S comes together in this place, and they also come together in this place, but there's already X in the middle. That actually shows that the argument is what? Valid. But some people will ask me that why is it that even though the T and X, there's no X in this place, in this first place, that the two of them comes together, and I still say the argument is valid? Of course yes, because when they say X, it means some, and some in logic means at least one. So that means if there's at least one timid Nigerian that is the superstitious people, then this proposition is already correct. So that means this X have already indicated that there's at least one person that is T and there is also what? X. So that means this argument is valid. So what's the form? I figure 1. So anytime you test an argument and the form is I figure 1, automatically that argument is what? Valid, because this particular one is valid. So let's now test the second syllogism, number 2. So we draw our 3 circle again. So the predicate of our conclusion will be on the right hand side, the subject of our conclusion will be on the left hand side, and the middle term will be in the middle. So now if you should look at this argument now, some T are S, then the second one is all T are P. You know, a rule of syllogism states that when you diagram the two premises, the conclusion should automatically diagram itself. However, in a situation whereby you have a particular proposition coming first before a universal proposition, you have to diagram the universal proposition before diagramming the particular proposition. This particular statement now, the first one is this particular argument now, the first one is some T are S. That means it is a particular proposition. Then the second one is all T are P, universal proposition. The first one is particular affirmative, while the second one is universal affirmative. So if you want to diagram it, you have to diagram the universal first before diagramming the particular. So all T are P. All I just need to do is to look for T that is not a P and shade it to indicate that it is empty, because all T are P. That's what the statement told us. All T are P. So all these T that are here like this now, all these T, they are T that is not P. As you can see, this is the circle of P and it did not even enter this place. So this is T that is not a P, and it is what? It is empty, because all T are P. So the the proposition states that all T are P. So that means if there's any T that is existing at all, it has to be the one that is a P, because all T are P. So this is the circle of T and this is the circle of P. So all this space that I shaded now, it is the space of T that is not a P, and that place is what? Is not existing, because all T are P. Then this next one is saying that some T are S. So I just need for where T and S comes together and put X there to show that there are some people there. So some T and X. So this is the circle of S and this is the circle of T. So that means this particular place now, T and S come together, but it is already empty. I cannot put my X there again. So my X has to be in the middle. So what's the conclusion? Some P are S. So this is the circle of P and this is the circle of X. So they also come together in this middle. So that means this particular argument is valid. So what's the form? I figure 3. So valid. So that means this particular argument is what? Is valid. That SORITE is valid. So a SORITE is only valid when all the syllogisms inside that SORITE are valid. As long as there is one that is invalid, then the whole SORITE is what? Invalid. So the two of them are valid, then the SORITE is what? Is valid. So let us give another example of another SORITE to test the validity or invalidity again. So we are going to be using another argument to explain everything again. So let's say in a situation whereby we have a question like all lawyers are sane people. All lawyers are sane people. Okay, I don't want to waste too much of space. So I'll be representing them with letters, but I'll be pronouncing it out for people that want to write. So all lawyers, I'm representing L with lawyers, are sane people. So all lawyers are sane people. All sane people are people who can study logic. All lawyers are sane people. All sane people are people who can study logic. No daughter of yours. I'm representing D with daughter of yours. No daughter of yours or no daughters of yours are people who can study logic. No daughters of yours are people who can study logic. Therefore, no daughters of yours are lawyers. So let me take the proposition again. All lawyers are sane people. All sane people are people who can study logic. No daughter of yours are people who can study logic. Therefore, no daughter of yours are lawyers. So now don't forget that the formula remains n minus 1, number of premises minus 1. How many premises do we have in this particular SORITE? 3 premises minus 1 give us 2. That means we are going to be having 2 different syllogisms in this particular SORITE. And how do we do it? The first one, the second one, we bring in the conclusion. Then that conclusion is going to start as the main premise for the second set of syllogism. So what's the first statement? All lawyers are sane people. The second one, all sane people are people who can study logic. So we'll bring in the conclusion ourselves. Don't forget that the middle term, that's what you look out for first, because the middle term will be in the two premise but will not be in the conclusion. S is our middle term, so automatically S will not be in the conclusion. The L, which is the major term, will be in the predicate of the conclusion. So that means this one will be here, L will be here, the predicate of the conclusion. Then P, which is already in the minor premise, which is also the minor term, will be the subject of the conclusion. Automatically, I told you that it is not possible for universal proposition if the two premises are universal proposition, automatically this conclusion also has to be universal. The only time that the conclusion will be particular is if there is at least one particular in the premise. If there's at least one particular in the premise, then the conclusion will be particular. If there is at least one negative in the premise, the conclusion will be negative. But this particular argument now, there is no particular proposition in the premise, so it is not possible for the conclusion also to be particular. It has to be universal. And there is no negative proposition in the premise, so it is also not possible for the conclusion to be negative. It has to be affirmative. So all P are L. So that's the first one. And like I told you, once you already bring out the the conclusion of the first one, is going to serve as the main premise for the second set of syllogism. So the second one will be all P are L. Then you will now continue from where you stop. This is where you stop. You stop at L, so you continue again. No D are P. Therefore, no D are L. So automatically it will form itself. There's no, as long as we follow the rule, it will form itself. See, the middle term is already in the two premise, but it is absent in the conclusion. The predicate of the conclusion is our major term, and the major term is already in the major premise. The subject of our conclusion is the minor term, and the minor term is already in the minor premise. And don't forget that when I was explaining it, I said as long as there is one negative in the premise, the conclusion has to be negative. Because there is one negative in the premise, the conclusion is also what? Negative. So if you follow the rule, there's no way that it is not going to form itself. So the conclusion is already negative, and the reason is because there is one negative already in the premise. So now let's now test the validity of these two. If these two arguments are valid, then the whole SORITES is valid. So the first one, you draw the three circle. So the predicate of the conclusion to the right hand side, the subject of the conclusion to the left hand circle, while the middle term will be in the middle. That's simple. So now all L are S. If all L are X, if all lawyers are sane people, all L are S, then you have to look for L that is not a S to shade it up that is what? It is empty. So any L that is not S will be empty because all L are S. So let's look for the circle of L. This is the circle of L. So anywhere this circle of S did not enter, see, anywhere this circle of S did not enter and it is inside the circle of L will be empty. Because all L are S. So I've already shaded it off to indicate that what it is empty. Then the second one says that all S are P. So this is the circle of S and this is the circle of P. So all S are P. Any S that is not a P is also empty. So you shade it off. Shading it off indicated as what? It is empty. Because all S are P. So S that is not a P is empty. So therefore, the conclusion states that all P are S. So let's check whether the conclusion has already diagrammed itself. If it has diagrammed itself, that argument is valid. But if it has not diagrammed itself, then that argument is invalid. So all P are L. So let's look for whether we still have P that is not L to indicate that what? The argument is invalid. So as you can see, we still have the space of P that is not even L and it is not empty. So that argument is invalid. And the form is A figure 4. A figure 4. That's the form. So all P are L. That's the conclusion. The conclusion has not diagram itself because we still have the space of P that is not L and it is not shaded to indicate that that place is what? Is empty. Although any argument at all, any argument that is invalid in a syllogism has committed a particular fallacy. I actually know the fallacy of this particular argument committed, and I'm going to write it now, but when we get to the formal fallacy and rule of syllogism, you are going to understand better. So the fallacy that this particular argument committed is called illicit minor. That's the name of the fallacy, illicit minor. So I'm still going to be explaining the formal fallacies that we have. So when we get there, you understand better. But the fallacy that this particular argument committed is illicit minor. There is a rule in syllogism that states that any term that is distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premise. This P minor term is distributed in the conclusion, but it is not distributed in the premise. As you can see, all S are P. A proposition did not distribute the predicate, it only distributed the subject. So this P has been distributed in the conclusion, but it is not distributed in the premise. So when that occurs, the fallacy that argument committed is called illicit minor. But when we get to formal fallacy, we are going to understand it better. So that first one is already invalid. So let's test the second one. We draw our circle again. So the predicate of the conclusion, right hand side, subject of the conclusion, left hand side, then middle term in the middle. So all P are L. So P that is not a L is empty. So this L and this P. So all P are L. So any P that is not L, let's say if people are not existing, so it is empty because all P are L. So now no D are P. If they say no D are P, you just have to look for anywhere D and P is coming together, shade it off to indicate that it is empty because no D are P. So D and P are coming together here. So I'm shading this place off to indicate that it is empty. D and P also comes together in this place, but then that place has already been shaded off, so there's no point in shading it again. So no D are P. That means any D that is a P is a lie. That place is empty. So no D are P. So now let's now look at the conclusion, whether there is already any D that is L. If that actually happened, then the argument is what? Invalid. No D are L. So where is D and L? D and L, no D are L. So that means this particular argument is what? Valid. And what's the form? A, E, figure 1. So let's look at it very well again, whether we did not make any mistake. Okay, this argument is invalid. It is not valid. I was actually thinking about it that the argument is invalid, but I'm trying to ensure that I've seen the fallacy before I stated that the argument is invalid. Because when looking at it, the conclusion states that no D are L, but D and L still comes together in this place, and this place is not shaded off. On a normal day, for it to be valid, it's supposed to be shaded off. So, and it is only this place that is already shaded. So that means this place is not empty, it is not shaded off, and they said no D are L. That means there must not be any D and L that is coming together, and it will not be what? Shaded off. So this argument is invalid. So when I said let us look at it very well before we move on, it's because I'm seeing an inconsistency that okay, there's a problem with this place, but I'm checking this place to see whether it has already contradicted any rule or it has already committed a fallacy, but I was not seeing it before, but then I've already seen it now. So this argument is invalid. And what fallacy does it commit? It committed fallacy of illicit major. That's the name of the fallacy, illicit major. As you can see in the conclusion, the major term is distributed, but it is not distributed in the premise. A proposition only distributes the subject term, it did not distribute the predicate. But E proposition distributes both the subject and the predicate. So this L is distributed in the conclusion, but it is not distributed in the premise. And there is a rule that states that if the major term is distributed in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the premise. But because I've not explained the rule of syllogism and formal fallacy, you might not understand yet. But I'm just trying to say that this argument is invalid, and the fallacy that it's committed is what? Illicit major. And the reason why it is invalid is because the conclusion did not diagram itself. No D are L. There's any space of D that is also L, and it is not empty, because this space has to be empty for this argument to be valid. So after shading the first premise all P are L, shading the second one no D are P. The conclusion therefore no D are L is supposed to diagram itself. And when they say no D are L, that means anywhere D and L is coming together, it has to be what? Empty, because no D at all are L. And this place is not being shaded, so it's indicated that what? It is not diagrammed yet, so the argument is invalid. So those are the examples that we are going to be using to explain SORITES.